Alright folks, it is now 1 p.m. EST, so we're gonna start the webinar. Welcome everyone, thanks for signing in today. The webinar, CICMH webinar is Managing Alcohol at Campus Events. If this is your first time on one of our webinars, welcome. And if you're having some trouble deciphering what's going on with all the various buttons on your screen, under the Files section under your screen should be an Adobe Connect guide for participants, and that should help you familiarize with what's on your screen right now. And if you look toward the other file that's on that screen, the webinar slides, you can be able to download a PDF of the slides today. Throughout the webinar, if and when you have questions, feel free to type them up using the chat function at the bottom right of your screen. And we'll start taking up those questions towards maybe around 1:45-ish. Other than that, enjoy the webinar, and if you are on the phone calling in, please make sure to keep yourself muted for the duration of the webinar. And now I'm going to hand it over to our presenters from the Ontario Public Health Association. All yours, guys.
Great, thank you. So my name is Pat Haw, and I'm from the Ontario Public Health Association. And I'll allow my co-presenter to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Amanda Palekia. I'm a health promoter with the Healthy Living Program at Halton Region, and I also support the OPHA Alcohol Work Group.
So today's presentation is being presented on behalf of the Ontario Public Health Association. So both Amanda and I are with public health units, and our day jobs are with that. So we are essentially volunteers and members of the OPHA. And so we really welcome and thank you for the opportunity to present to the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. And today's topic, as Perlin mentioned, is managing alcohol at campus events. So next slide. So the OPHA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization created in 1949. So we're about a bit over 70 years old. We bring together a broad spectrum of individuals and groups, and our membership is from a broad range of backgrounds, not only public health, but essentially anyone who is interested in advancing the health of Ontarians. So we have academics, we have healthcare providers, we have nonprofit sectors and the private sector representatives as well. The overall mission is to provide leadership on issues affecting public health and also to strengthen the impact of those working in public health in Ontario as well. So there's a list of activities that are listed there. If we go over to the next slide, one of the ways that OPHA works is through various work groups. So for example, Amanda and I are with the alcohol work group of the OPHA, and this work group was created in 2002, so about 20 years ago, to develop policy positions on alcohol on behalf of OPHA. So our mission is to strengthen the public health voice regarding the health and safety impact of alcohol policy. And the two items I'll highlight is one, to monitor the social and political landscape of alcohol, essentially to understand what's going on, the impact, and where things may be going. And secondly, we also work proactively with different types of stakeholders to respond to alcohol issues. So for example, most of our work recently has been with respect to public health units and also municipalities. And now we're branching out into, I guess in this case, the post-secondary sector as well. So if we go on to the next slide, the purpose of today's webinar, as we mentioned, we do try to reach out to different groups, and this webinar is one aspect of that. And so for today, we'll start off with an overview of alcohol use patterns and behavior in youth and young adults in Ontario, just to provide a very level context for everyone as to what the issue is with alcohol and youth. Secondly, we'll provide an overview of all the recent changes to alcohol policies and regulations in Ontario. And then lastly, we'll dive deeper into several issues that may affect campuses directly, and we'll present considerations on how venue operators and event hosts can implement to promote healthier alcohol use behavior and reduce risk and liability at campus events where alcohol is served and consumed.
I'm now going to share some stats on youth alcohol consumption locally here in Ontario. Contrary to some debate about health benefits arising from alcohol consumption in adulthood, you might hear this from time to time specifically around red wine, but also some other beverages. There are no known health benefits for youth. In fact, research shows that alcohol impacts the developing brain up till about age 24, but certainly mid-20s. And the younger a person starts drinking, the higher their risk for problems later in life, such as alcohol dependence and poor health outcomes. Young adults also tend to partake in more risky behavior, which leads to injuries and accidents while under the influence. You can see some data here gathered from the National College Health Assessment. I wanted to point out that in this context, college really means all post-secondary age students. The reason for this is that the health assessment is completed by the American College Health Association, but this is specifically in Ontario, Canada reference group. It's just a U.S. organization, so it's labeled college, but it's all post-secondary. So some important stats here are 60% of post-secondary students in Ontario reported past 30-day alcohol use, so 2/3. 12% reported driving after consuming any alcohol. Although that could include one drink, it is still concerning as 12% is a pretty high number. And 24% were involved in heavy drinking. And heavy drinking in this context is defined as 7 or more drinks on one occasion, which is quite a lot. Lastly, 37% of students reported doing something that they later regretted in the past year while under the influence.
Great, thank you. So now we'll talk about some of the changes to alcohol policies and regulations in Ontario. Now, before I get into this, alcohol policy is one of those areas where, nothing happened for a very long time, and then all of a sudden, a lot of things happened. And that really started around 2015, 2016. And of course, we had a different government at the time, and today we have a different one as well. And so I guess my point is that, some of the changes that we've mentioned here, it's not tied to any one particular government. I think some of the issues that OPHA has with alcohol policy, it's really long-standing, and it doesn't really cut across any one particular type of governing style. So now with that said, I'll first start off with some of the changes that have affected access to alcohol. So most people are probably aware of alcohol sales in grocery stores. Now that started around in 2016, and today I believe we're up to about 450 grocery stores that are selling beers, ciders, and so on. Hard liquor is not sold in grocery stores at the moment. So next, at the end of last year, the province started expanding its LCBO convenience store outlets. These are small stores in remote and rural communities where it doesn't make sense to have a standalone LCBO. And so the concept is that it's a store within a store, and the LCBO portion is basically operated and governed by LCBO. It allows alcohol sales in smaller communities, but at the same time, it limits it sort of like reflects the economic aspect of it as well. So also related to that is starting in around 2014, we saw alcohol sales starting in farmers markets across Ontario. There's also been changes to the permissible hours of sales. First with liquor sales license holders. So these are like bars, restaurants, events that are hosted under a special occasion permit, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. And so essentially now, liquor sales can start at 9 a.m., whereas before it was 11 a.m. We've also saw expansion in terms of the retail sales. So now it's retail stores can, on Sundays, I believe they can operate from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. And again, those hours are expanded from previously. The next access issues with the new Tailgate event special occasion permit. The primary feature here is that patrons can bring and consume their own alcohol, and we'll get much deeper into that a bit later. There's been expanded hours at airports, and if you go up beyond their security zone now, there's many airports have bars and restaurants, and now they can serve alcohol 24/7 essentially. And lastly, around 2016, 2017, LCBO really revamped its e-commerce platform, and part of that is that they started delivering alcohol through Canada Post. So moving on to the next slide. And we've also had changes to price and marketing. In terms of price, the lowest, the permissible sale price for beer is now $1 per beer. I'm sure everyone has heard of the Bucket Beer campaign and been in the media a lot, so that's fairly familiar. But also there's been a suspension in the annual increase in the provincial beer and wine taxes. So effectively, these two measures mean that the retail sale price of alcohol is lower than it probably should be. In terms of marketing, liquor sales license holders like bars and restaurants, again, they can now use terms like happy hour in their advertising. And of course, happy hour, I guess the connotation is that, alcohol prices are lower and therefore, it should be happy. So for the longest time, that wasn't permitted under the AGCO, the Alcohol Gaming Commission of Ontario's guidelines for bars and restaurants, but that was changed sometime last year. Casinos can also now advertise complimentary alcohol if they are licensed to do that. And then there's also marketing incentives for Bucket Beer at LCBO. So the overall issue with marketing and alcohol is that it really hasn't kept up with the changes in the media landscape, for example, social media and other ways that youth are being advertised towards. It also hasn't kept up with some of the evidence that we have now. So there's very strong evidence in terms of the impact of marketing and youth and young adult consumption. Some places like New York City, for example, they've went ahead and banned alcohol advertising on municipal property. And a lot of that came back from the scientific research around youth and marketing. Also, a lot of public transit agencies, or again, New York City, San Francisco, and others, they've looked at the evidence around youth and marketing towards youth, and they've went ahead and banned alcohol advertising within their assets. So moving on to the next slide. In terms of other changes, there's been changes at the national level. So there's a new type of alcoholic beverage called flavored purified alcoholic beverage. And there's a product there, F'd Up. That's the actual name of it. And if you Google that, you'll find the backstory behind that. And it's actually a tragic story. There was a death of a 14-year-old Quebec young woman who consumed this product. And after that, Health Canada went ahead and they placed regulations around this product. On top of that, at the national level, there's been the implementation of an annual increase in the excise tax. So it increases every year. Also, when edible cannabis was regulated, a provision in there is that prepackaged alcoholic cannabis beverages are not permitted for sale in Canada. And then lastly, Canada's food guide was revised within the past couple of years, and for the first time, alcohol is mentioned in that report. So lastly, there's also been changes to impaired driving, in particular, the rules around whether an officer can mandate a breath test from you or not. So next slide. In terms of things that we're looking out for, so we suspect that the permissible alcohol sales hours may change for other venues and for other times as well. So the one example we listed there is that the current closing time for most license holders is 2 a.m. And there's always been talk about extending that to 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. So we may see that as well. Also, we might see the 24/7 7-day-a-week service may be introduced to other venues as well. Secondly, we may see more retail expansion. So we've already seen grocery stores, the LCBO convenience outlets, but we may see more expansion into convenience stores and other formats like big box outlets. And then lastly, and we'll talk more about this later on, is that municipal councils can now have their authority to designate any public place for alcohol consumption. This is also known as public drinking or open container laws. And then lastly, there's some overall emerging trends. For example, cannabis edibles are now on the market. And so one of our concerns is, in 5 to 10 years, when cannabis edibles are more common and people start mixing it with alcohol, what does that mean, and what are sort of the policies we need to implement to sort of safeguard against that? And then lastly, there is maybe potential for expansion of app-based alcohol delivery services.
The OPHA Alcohol Work Group has recently focused a great deal of attention on supporting municipalities, as Pat was began to touch on, by providing evidence-based recommendations that will help strengthen local level policies around alcohol consumption. So right now on municipal property, anyone wishing to host an event may apply for a special occasion permit. We refer to these as an SOP, so you'll hear this referenced a few more times throughout this presentation. And this is to serve alcohol at an event that does not have a liquor license normally. This also applies to other venues that are not licensed, but might not be municipal property, so things like an art gallery, a salon, museums, etc. The venue owner, whether it's a municipality or a private owner, has the authority to require conditions above and beyond what's required through the SOP, but those are the minimum requirements that legally must be met, and that is all established through the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario. Most municipalities have their own policies referred to as municipal alcohol policies, or MAP, or MAP for short. Municipal alcohol policies are used in Ontario and other jurisdictions across Canada, the US, and others to provide criteria around responsible alcohol use on municipal property. Since the alcohol landscape in Ontario has changed in recent years, some municipalities have proposed changes or updates to reflect new policies. In fact, this is something that we're working on right now in Halton Region, and others on our OPHA Alcohol Work Group are striving towards as well. One that I wanted to point out is the City of Waterloo. They have proposed some changes, which include increasing their insurance to $5 million. It was previously $2 million. Not allowing tailgate special occasion permits, adding a definition for this new special occasion permit so that it's clearly defined, and specifying that they're not permitted on municipal property. The City of Waterloo also recommends not allowing consumption in public areas, as Pat was speaking about earlier. It's actually not something that any municipality in Ontario has adopted yet, but it is allowed if they so wished. It's also recommended that post-secondary campuses either develop or update their existing campus alcohol policies, outlining the terms of events sanctioned by a special occasion permit or a catering endorsement. Remember that the criteria outlined through the AGCO is only the minimum requirements, and property owners, including a campus, can require much more if they wish. Some examples of additions to policies that I've seen in campus alcohol policies include things like a dry or substance-free orientation week for all events on campus, and special residence alcohol policies for students who are living on campus. There's a couple of examples included here on the slide. Queen's University has proposed adding that tailgate event special occasion permits will be prohibited on campus. This is important because these new tailgate permits apply only to professional, semi-professional, or post-secondary sporting events, so certainly a university or college campus would fall into that category. I also came across the University of Windsor's policy. It's one of many that are available just on their school's website, but I found that it was quite robust and includes some specific criteria for things like catering services, a residence alcohol policy, events that take place in residences, a student recreation and athletics alcohol policy, and a policy, it's called the Thirsty Scholar alcohol policy, which I believe is their on-campus pub, so their pub has its own policy. And then other campus events. So they're all clearly outlined within this one broader policy. So I thought that that was a reasonable example to check out if you're interested in one that has many different components included.
Great. So now we'll talk about specific changes that may affect alcohol service at events on campus. So if we move over to the next slide, so the issues on the left-hand side, those are the ones we will be talking about. Now, this content that you see is derived from the resource or the document that you see on the right-hand side there. That was originally developed for municipalities, and a lot of the content is very relevant to campus or any other operator really. We've adapted some of the content today to be more relevant to this audience. And we've also added the discussion on public drinking. And for each one, we'll talk about the context, we'll talk about the health and safety and liability concerns, and then we'll also outline some mitigation measures that you as a campus can consider.
So as we know already, alcohol service can begin at 9 a.m. And we know from the evidence that increased hours of alcohol service are related to increased alcohol consumption and therefore alcohol harms. There are some specific concerns with this that are particular to post-secondary age culture. At some times in the year, students may partake in events such as pancake keggers, boozy brunches, bottomless mimosas, and other popular morning drinking trends. The new 9 a.m. service time means that alcohol consumption can start even earlier, leading to more alcohol consumed throughout the day. It also means folks can drink ahead of sporting events such as road races, mud runs, and other fun sporting events, but at the cost of health and safety. So not to say that someone who's serious about running a marathon is going to consume alcohol before their race, but there are many fun athletic events that this might be considered something that's fun to do before partaking. Lastly, it goes without saying that booze before breakfast is not likely to positively impact anyone's academic performance, which is another concern for this particular age group. Some mitigation considerations should an event begin at 9 a.m. can include the following. Increasing liability insurance, the recommendation right now from the evidence is at least $5 million. Limiting some of the number and types of alcohol served during the early hours. So if one was going to serve alcohol, perhaps you would limit things like shots or pitchers or high alcohol beverage coolers and other things like that. Food service should be substantial, not just salty snacks. Consider requiring EMS on site for mass sporting events. If there's an associated beer tent or other types of alcohol service, you might want to have extra EMS available in these areas. The 2019 Toronto Scotiabank Marathon served alcohol, but it was actually alcohol-free Heineken. So Heineken was there doing their promos, but it was their alcohol-free product. So I thought that was interesting. There was still the same camaraderie and culture around having a beer post-race. But it was the alcohol-free version. So that was, I think, a reasonable mitigation consideration while still being able to maintain sponsorship from an industry sponsor.
Okay, so the next item is tailgate event special occasion permits. So since about mid-2019, special event SOPs have been available from the AGCO. And again, as we mentioned before, the unique feature here is that patrons can bring and consume their own alcohol. This is otherwise known as BYOB, or US-style tailgating. And now I did mention that last part because in Canada, the tailgating culture isn't the same as in the US. So for example, back last spring, when the Toronto Raptors were sort of going through their run, there were a number of Toronto Raptors tailgate event parties around the country, but those events had nothing to do with alcohol. It wasn't served. They were family events. And so I'm just mentioning this point because in the Canadian context, tailgating doesn't necessarily have the same meaning as US-style tailgating. But in this case, it does actually mean BYOB, or patrons can bring their own alcohol. So this is a special occasion permit, and as Amanda mentioned, there are minimum standards, but we feel that the minimum standards are severely lacking. They are missing many long-standing practices that are known to manage alcohol use. For example, things like smart serve training among staff, things like having a physical fence around your event so that you can screen people when they leave. So very basic things like that. Now HACO can require additional conditions, but we feel that the base or the minimum requirements are nowhere near adequate. Secondly, approval from a sporting events authority is not required. So what this means is that any person can sort of set up an event. They may not necessarily mention your school's name or anything like that, but they can sort of like hint at it. And there's absolutely nothing that you can do. That's one problem that we had. And then lastly, and again, it comes back to the Canadian thinking around tailgating. If you mention it to someone, many people may think that, oh yeah, it's like a free-for-all. You show up and you start drinking. But what we found in our research is that, in fact, many U.S. institutions, many U.S. post-secondary schools, they've actually started going ahead and implementing a managed approach to this. So the one example I have there is with the Buffalo Bills, where they've really you know, it's still, you're still driving in, and you're still you're setting up a little kitchen and everything, but at the same time, it's much more managed. And in many post-secondary schools in the U.S., they've started implementing much more robust measures around this. So that's something we wanted to clarify as well. So moving on to the next slide, in terms of health and safety and liability concerns, many students will be under the age of drinking, or they may be very inexperienced alcohol users. And so that environment is probably not the best opportunity to introduce individuals into drinking. And related to that, it's not the best environment to role model good alcohol use behavior. There's also a huge potential to disrupt non-drinking patrons, families, and other spectators who are just there, you know, to have a family-friendly type of sporting event. There's also significant concerns for the safety and nuisance for the neighboring residents and commercial enterprises and so on. And then lastly, there's this very strange thing where it conflicts with existing bans on public drinking and public intoxication. So for example, there's one scenario where you know, the tailgate party may be a couple blocks from the stadium where the event is being held. And so now you have a bunch of people who have been drinking perhaps all morning, and now they're walking over to the tailgating party. Many of them may be intoxicated, which is against current legislation. Many of them may be still drinking on the way there, which again violates some of the public drinking laws. And so there's a lot of contradictions within this type of event and also existing legislation around drinking in public. So moving on to the next slide, the mitigation consideration in this context is fairly straightforward, and it's really to not sanction or approve any event under a tailgate event SOP on campus or school property. In addition, to write this into your campus alcohol policy so that it's really clear to everyone who may be considering this. It also sets the campus, it sets the school's position very clearly on this. So we added a note there saying that in the original OPH resource, we do provide some mitigation measures because as a nonpartisan organization, we do recognize that some municipalities may choose to do this, and so we provided other mitigation options. But in this case, we don't think that tailgating SOPs and post-secondary schools go together in any way.
Moving on to price. Certainly alcohol is also becoming more affordable in the province. Minimum retail prices are lower now than several years ago, and some taxes have been paused. It's worrisome because some young adults tend to favor less expensive alcohol products. So again, looking at this particular group of young adults and college age or post-secondary age students, we know that the higher the price, the lower the consumption. So there's an inverse relationship there. The AGCO sets a minimum price of $2 for a standard drink sold at licensed establishments. We also know that the evidence tells us it should be higher, at least $3 or more. Off-premise, at the LCBO and the beer store, prices are even lower than the $2. They're actually as low as $1. Although most places don't sell it that cheap, it is possible to sell that cheap. Municipalities and post-secondary institutions have the opportunity to establish their own minimum prices that are higher than the AGCO requirements, and we do recommend that. Of course, we also keep in mind that some events have no charge for alcoholic drinks when you obtain your special occasion permit, so things like family barbecues and weddings. So this doesn't apply to that, but in cases where you are selling alcohol to the public, we recommend adopting higher than the AGCO recommended prices. A few other mitigation considerations include Increasing minimum prices along with inflation and marketing promotions related to price should be avoided. So avoiding all of those 2-for-1 specials, happy hour, supersizing a drink, etc. Research also suggests that minimum prices should be higher for beverages with higher alcohol content, and that should increase along with stronger drinks, keeping in mind standard drink sizes. Provision of food is something we touched on but didn't discuss too much in detail, but food is actually no longer required to be served at SOP events in the province, so effectively there are alcohol-only events permitted. This is worrisome because alcohol certainly helps to slow alcohol absorption and reduce the speed of intoxication. Food should always be available, and to that effect, it should be substantial meals that have the greatest impact rather than just salty snacks. Salty snacks actually tend to increase thirst and encourage people to drink even more. Lastly, the requirement for barriers or partitions was removed recently from the SOP requirements to the effect that a continuous physical barrier separating the designated alcohol drinking area is no longer required. However, this is an essential mitigation strategy for controlling entry points, checking ID, preventing folks from bringing their own alcohol into the event, managing capacity, intervening drinking and driving, and so much more. So it's really the only way that staff can prevent those who shouldn't be drinking from doing so or for being in an area where they could possibly do so. Therefore, we highly recommend, and the evidence highly recommends, that a continuous barrier with a designated entry and exit points that are monitored be implemented at any on-campus event.
Okay, so the next topic is edible cannabis and edible beverages. So in terms of the context, edible cannabis is now available on the market. It may not be widespread, but in the long term, we suspect that the availability may increase. We mentioned before that pre-packaged alcohol and cannabis beverages are not permitted for sale in Canada, so it's a national-wide prohibition. But at the same time, we recognize that some forms of cannabis may facilitate co-use. So you can imagine all the different ways that they can make an edible cannabis, and on top of that, because it is, you can basically make it into anything, then it's easy to conceal and hide in plain sight as well. So with the last point there has an asterisk there. At the time that we produced their publication, our sort of understanding was that the sale of edible cannabis was not expected to be a major part of a special occasion permit where alcohol is sold, given the stringent licensing requirements. There's a note there saying that in February 10, 2020, the Ontario government launched a consultation that looks into the expansion of cannabis business opportunities, including what they are calling consumption venues and special occasion permits for events such as outdoor festivals and concerts. Now, the consultation doesn't specifically mention alcohol, but you can imagine that alcohol and cannabis may be a feature of events going forward. And so we're just highlighting that we're waiting for any news and information from the province before we provide any more guidance on that. So in terms of the health and safety concerns, there's evidence to indicate that the co-use of alcohol and cannabis may lead to elevated THC levels compared to cannabis alone, and this may lead to enhanced symptoms of cannabis use. So related to that, the evidence shows that co-users tend to drink more alcohol as well. So this has implications for things like intoxication and alcohol poisoning. We also see that among youth and young adults, the combined use of alcohol and cannabis is the most common form of polysubstance use, and it's also related to other harms such as legal, health, and relationship issues. Now, in terms of mitigation, the primary one is really to prohibit all edible cannabis at events where alcohol is served. We've left out cannabis smoking because that's generally covered under the Smoke-Free Ontario Act, and that's generally well established and taken care of. Related to that, it's to prohibit event staff from mixing alcoholic beverages with cannabis edibles for patrons. So it's one thing where a patron may sneak something in and mix it with their drink. It's another issue if event staff start doing it for the patrons. It's not only are you sort of like facilitating it, but there may be liability issues as well. Thirdly, we're looking to prohibit the consumption of alcohol and recreation cannabis by event staff. I think that's pretty straightforward. The fourth point is related to training, and that's really to require event staff to be aware of the harms of the co-use. The current training for bartenders and waitresses and so on may not be adequate for this aspect. And lastly, it's related to signing, and it's to require the postage of signing about the harms throughout the venue. So the last issue we'll talk about today is public drinking. Now, we did add this to the for today's presentation, so it's not in the resource at the moment. Essentially today, any municipal council can pass a bylaw to designate any public place for alcohol use or public drinking. And just to be clear, at the moment you can't do that. So at the moment it's the status quo. There's no public drinking unless a municipality passes a bylaw to do this. One of our issues with this is that the enabling legislation is much less prescriptive than elsewhere in Canada. So for example, in Montreal, there is public drinking in parks, but it's restricted to certain picnic tables. You must have a meal with it, and I believe there's time limits as well. In BC, the provincial legislation restricts it to parks, and I believe there's a food requirement as well. And then in Alberta, again, it's restricted to parks, and there's a food requirement. Now, having said that, within the past couple of weeks, there's been a proposal in Alberta to remove that food requirement. The other issue, and we sort of alluded to this in the past, is that there's been no change to provincial public intoxication restrictions. And the two things, in public intoxication and public drinking, sort of go hand in hand. So if you're an enforcement officer, for example, and you see someone drinking, in some cases, even in Toronto, they may let it go. But if it's sort of, it may lead to a dangerous situation, then that public drinking prohibition sort of lets that officer intervene before things get out of hand, before people start harming themselves. So without that, you sort of remove that opportunity. And it's sort of this area where you can't intervene until they're intoxicated, which may lead to issues later on. And then lastly, municipalities already have a system whereby the public can sort of set up an event, like in the park or maybe a town square, where alcohol is served, and it balances, that sort of requirement, but also the requirement to protect public health and safety. So there's already a mechanism for this. We don't feel that designating any place for public drinking is necessary. Now, in terms of health and safety concerns, I've already mentioned some of them. I think a lot of this is fairly straightforward. And having said that, the OPHA does not support designating any public place for public drinking outside of a sanctioned event where, for example, the municipal alcohol policy would apply. In terms of next steps on this issue, the OPHA Alcohol Working Group is looking into this, and we hope to develop some sort of resource or some sort of guidance for municipalities in the future.
So in summary, what we recommend is working with your local public health unit, police service, and other community partners to develop or even just update your existing campus alcohol policy. Including students, parents, and faculty in consultations is a great idea to really dig deep into what's happening on campus and what the concerns are, if any. Keeping the 11 a.m. start time is recommended, so not moving that till 9 a.m., as well as prohibiting tailgate event SOPs, as some are already moving towards. The other provisions that were discussed today are also really good considerations, including adopting minimum price requirements, maintaining physical barriers and fencing, and absolutely prohibiting mixing of alcohol with edible cannabis. For additional resources, many of you already might be familiar with the PEPA framework. PEPA stands for Post-Secondary Education Partnership Alcohol Harms, and it's affiliated with the CCSA and has developed an evidence-based framework to address high-risk drinking on campuses. It's pretty comprehensive, and it has been adopted at some Canadian campuses. One that I know of is the University of Guelph. The framework touches on several of the points that we discussed today, including availability and marketing, pricing, community engagement, and including campus services. So if you're interested, there's a link. You'll get the slides later. There's a link to their website, so you could check it out and reach out if you're looking for more information. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. We'd be happy to take any questions or comments at this time.
Thank you so much, Amanda and Pat, for that great presentation. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, if any of the participants have any questions for our presenters, use the chat function at the bottom right of your screen. If you type it, we'll see it. Oh, we have somebody typing up a question. And while we're just waiting for some questions to roll in, I just want to let people know that at the end of the webinar, there is going to be a survey that pops up to let us know your feedback for the webinar. Okay, first question that we have. Regarding approval from the sporting event authority not being required, is this different than the property owner? For example, if it is a municipality-owned property, would they still need approval from the municipality for alcohol SOPs/tailgating events?
I could probably start with that. So with SOPs, an individual can apply to HECO, and part of that is they need approval from the property owner. And if the municipality is the property owner, then they would go to the municipality. Or if it's like a private owner, then they would go to the private owner. Or if it's like a campus or a post-secondary education, they would go to the post-secondary education. So it's whoever the property owner is. Now, what's interesting with the tailgating part is that municipalities don't have any input into, so for example, if the event is being hosted on private property, the municipality doesn't have input into that. Sporting organizations don't have input into that. But of course, there are public health and safety concerns. There are externalities that impact the public. And so there's a bit of a disconnect there, I think, in terms of how that policy was rolled out.
Hope that answers your question, Melissa. Thanks. I'm going to advance the slide here in the presentation just so you can see our links if you're interested, where the OPHA alcohol work group resources and other information is located, and how you could contact us if you think of more questions later on in the day. Although we're getting one more question right now, so we'll hang on for a little bit longer.
Yep. So next question is, has the OPHA sent the new guide directly to municipalities?
Good question. So with the OPHA alcohol work group, many of our members are from public health units. And so, for example, I believe there's 22 health units that are representative. And those individuals work with their municipalities. Right, so for example, in Toronto, I work with my partners in licensing and so on, and I'm sure in Houghton, Amanda, you do the same. And so we've sort of worked through the alcohol work group members for them to reach out to their municipal partners. And the resource is really a way to, it's something that's already made that can be sort of cited in any type of like staff report or any supporting document. And so that's sort of how we've approached it. We've also just, sort of like did that standard dissemination approach where we've sent it out to different stakeholders, including the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health and others as well. So we had a fairly broad, I guess, dissemination or knowledge exchange type approach.
Thanks, Pat. And one more question that we have is, who on post-secondary campuses would be the best to connect with to discuss updating or creating campus alcohol policies, in your opinion? That's an interesting question.
That is interesting. Here in Halton, we are working with one of our local colleges with a health promoter that they have, just to sort of start the conversation and begin to have this discussion around who could we contact, what would this need to look like, who do we need to engage with, those sorts of things. So I would suggest, if you have connections with the health organizations at a local institution, you could always start there, or even reaching out just to student services to find out, who's in charge of, the organizations that run different campus pubs and things like that, and maybe find a contact that way. But I think it might be specific to each different campus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would also just add that you could contact your local health unit, and they may have an individual, or they probably likely will have an individual. And if not, health units often have relationships already with post-secondary institutions for different types of public health types of issues. So that's another avenue as well, is to contact your local health units.
Thanks. And just to add to that, you're right, Amanda, in that it is very specific to each campus, because often we have people working in roles with different names at every single campus, so it's hard to say across the board who would be the best person in that position to connect with. But one of the other things you can do is, generally most campuses have some sort of mental health strategy, and a alcohol or substance use policy is usually embedded within that strategy, and often you'll find who was responsible, which was the working group, and the names of the people responsible for writing those recommendations or that strategy. So that might be another place to start. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. So just gonna wrap up, and again, thanks guys for your really informative presentation, and thank you everyone for attending. So tomorrow there will be a follow-up email that's going to go out with a copy of the slides as well as the link to the recording of the webinar. So again, thanks everyone for attending, and take care.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you.